Welcome back, everybody, to our QuaranSTREAMs Answers for COVID-19. I just got off a board meeting and excited to share some updates with you. As always, I'm Abrar Omeish, one of your members at large on the Fairfax County School Board.
And I'm Kimberly Boateng, the student representative on the school board.
And we are pleased today to be joined with our special guest,
Leslie Sale. I'm Director of Policy at the Virginia Department of Education.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leslie, for joining us. Of course, as always, we're going to go through some updates, talk about FCPS specific information, the latest that we have for you, and then we'll go into a discussion. We'll hear from Leslie about what's going on her end of things, and we'll open it up to live Q&A to all of you. So to start us off here, as always, if you want to join reminders for the QuaranSTREAMs, you can text to the number 81010. You can text at the @ QuaranSTR, and you'll get text reminders for every session. The last session we had the Department of Family Services. Highly encourage you to check out some of the resources that were there. And this Sunday, we'll be joined with some mental health experts to talk about how we can improve the well-being of ourselves and of our homes. It is Educator Appreciation Week. I want a huge shout out to all our educators, not only our teachers, but all the staff who are working so hard, in particular in this time, my mother being one of them, but really providing the best and to our young people all across the state and the county, of course. In addition, as my colleagues mentioned today in the board meeting, I will say Ramadan Mubarak to all those who are observing. It's rare that I kind of point to my Muslim identity, but I am fasting today, and you know, we'll remind everyone that it is a month of a lot of spiritual purification and reflection, and I hope it's blessed for everyone who's observing. So far in our county, we have 5,116 cases of COVID. 846 folks are hospitalized, 218 have passed already, and 213 of those cases are new today. So as always, we want to make sure we're staying safe and healthy and taking the appropriate measures to do so. The governor, as you may have heard, has announced that they're easing some of the restrictions, and we're going to be phasing in to a return to normalcy. But they've made it clear that that doesn't mean it's still not the safest option to distance and to stay home. So as long as that's possible for you, we want to make sure that we take heed and continue to follow that example. In Fairfax County particularly, we are still climbing up the exponential curve, which means we have not really hit the point where we've flattened it enough to feel assured yet. So we want to make sure, again, that we continue to distance and stay home as much as possible. For those folks who may have questions about how to access healthcare and are not covered during this tough time, you can call Cover Virginia's call center, and that's 1-855-242-8282. We want to make sure everyone is taken care of. And again, you can watch our stream from the previous time about more details as to what income and other supports are available to your family. With that, the election, there are 2 elections coming up. I want to make sure folks are aware that they can request their ballots, and there are deadlines. So the Vienna Town Council and Clifton Town Council elections will be May 19th. You want to make sure to request your ballot before May 12th, which is coming up real soon. I believe that's Tuesday. So make sure that you submit the paperwork to get that. June 23rd is the Democratic and Republican primary for Senate and congressional races across the state. And in Fairfax County, there are some challengers. So be sure to look out and request that ballot. The deadline to register or update your voter registration is May 26th. Finally, for general updates, we had a school board meeting today. We discussed a number of topics. As we pointed out in our previous stream, we have a budget work session on Monday. If you kind of want to follow along and need some helpful breakdown, be sure to check our previous stream where we went over some of the topics to expect. This meeting in particular, we were encouraged to find out that the adult and community education program, which normally hosts tens of classes over the summer, is moving online. So the 160 classes will be offered and adapted that way for this year. There was talk about a McLean modular edition. I just wanted to make sure the community was aware that this was something that was discussed in the previous round of the CIP, the Capital Improvement Plan. It's nothing to be really surprised about, but we're going to continue calling for transparency and making sure that the community is aware of every step as it's taken. Right now, we have 5 overcrowded high schools. 4 of them have a plan moving forward, and McLean was the one that didn't. And so we're grateful to the community advocates who brought that to our attention. And if you want some more detail on that, my colleague from the Drainsville district, Elaine Tolan, has really been doing some extensive work and gave a brief overview during today's school board meeting, which is available on the FCPS website and on our YouTube, on Fairfax County Public Schools YouTube, for you to watch the meeting. With that, I'm going to go to Kimberly for some updates on the food and technology situation in the county.
So for food, as of today, FCPS has served a total of 768,315 meals. All curbside pickups, FCPS sites and pop-up locations are going to be operating per usual, as there has been no changes since the last QuaranSTREAM session. The times were recently changed, so if you have any concerns of what times it might be, make sure to check the website of your nearest pop-up site. In terms of technology distribution, as of Tuesday, there's been 17,424 laptops distributed and 1,322 MiFi devices. So as of yesterday, 10,040 paperless requests were have been made. So make sure that if you do feel as if you can go paperless, it will help the county a lot in terms of money and resources. So if you're able to, please opt out of the paper packets that have been sent out. I think Abrar can speak to, I'm not sure if we talked about it in the past, but yeah, if you're able to, you can opt to go paperless.
Yeah, we've shown where that is on the website, and anyone who has questions, it's in the FAQ sheet as well. If you have any questions about that, feel free to ask in the Q&A and we can walk you through if you have that concern. Thank you, Kimberly. The academic situation. So since we have transitioned, luckily we are now rolling smoothly, utilizing both Google and Blackboard Collaborate Ultra in our classrooms. There have been 30,247 synchronous learning sessions and 270,340 attendees as of today. So we're going to continue hopefully increasing those numbers and facilitating learning. AP exams start next week. Huge shout out to students, including Kimberly, who are stressing over these exams, wishing them the best of luck. We want to make sure you check your email. There will be a schedule sent out to you by College Board. There's also an exam demo that you can sit through just to make sure you're set up and feel the conditions of the test before you actually have to take it. And more information, like I said, will be sent out to student emails. And then 2 days before the exam, each student will receive their e-ticket through email. So make sure you have the opportunity to check in and are kind of mentally prepared before you have to sit down for the actual test. The IB College Fair has moved online so that students are able to access from 17 international and 22 US colleges and their IB policies to get a better sense of how your credits may transfer or what to expect. You can register for this through your school. So if you haven't already heard from your IB coordinators, be sure to reach out. Regarding seniors, so right now, seniors and parents are being surveyed regarding graduation options. If you haven't heard about that and you've been wanting to offer your feedback, be sure to contact your principal. An update will be provided at the May 11th school board meeting. So I look forward to hearing from staff as to what their plan is, and then also bringing forth ideas. So your opportunity to voice your concern if you're a senior or a parent of a senior. This Saturday, I'm having a call with all the presidents of the senior class councils in every high school. So if you, obviously in your high school, be in touch with your class council to let them know your ideas and what you want to bring forward so that they bring that to me. And then following that, we will also be hosting a special edition of our QuaranSTREAM to brainstorm with the community and give everyone the opportunity to give the ideas that they want brought forth to staff as we plan alternatives to graduation, because we want to make sure we celebrate all our seniors and make this as special as possible given the conditions. Finally, for seniors, there is Northern Virginia Community College is having a webinar Tuesday at 5 p.m. to kind of talk about post-college options, funding opportunities and resources that are out there, and planning for the future, all kinds of next steps for high school students. So be sure to look out for that. It was sent in the FCPS communication and in the update, which is also posted on the website. With that, Kimberly will tell us a little more on special education and English language learning supports.
Yes. Okay, so for special education, there's a new special education newsletter as of May 4th. In order to get there, you have to go through the main website, daily updates, and click May 4th. If parents do not want to sign up for the TLP or temporary learning plan, school staff will collaborate to address your concern. If necessary, an IEP meeting will be scheduled. Services will still be available unless parents choose to opt out. IEPs will be implemented once schools resume. FCPS is providing parent support lines in 8 different languages that is available on the FCPS Special Education newsletter. For more questions, you can contact your procedural support liaison, the assistant ombudsman at fcps.edu, the Parent Resource Center, prc@fcps.edu, the Office of Special Education Instruction, Office of Due Process and Eligibility, and emails are available on the special education newsletter. So with English language learning, weekly packets for level 1 and level 2, I believe, are being sent out, have been sent out.
Paper packets, yep.
Yeah, the paper packets. So you should expect or already have these packets if this applies to you.
Thank you, Kimberly. And as always, many of these resources are offered in many languages. So if you know a neighbor or a friend who may need that access, please point them to that direction. They're all listed on the website with hotlines, in addition to the translation feature on each page. There is a question here related to some of the previous points that were made. So how do we know whether technology supports or these kinds of things are addressing the need, right? So these numbers are big, but relative to the need. Absolutely valid question. Angela, thank you for pointing it out. I do want to say, as of this point, all high school and middle school students should have received technology supplies. If that is not the case, if you're aware of shortcomings, please be sure to contact your principal. If you have further troubles, you're welcome to contact your school board member. I look forward to doing my part in those cases. K through 2 is waiting until all of K above that has those resources. So we know that at this point that's been completed, and hopefully, you know, whatever oversights are there can be brought to our attention. And I'm certainly digging, as are my colleagues, to make sure that we're aware of any area that those exist. So before we transition here, real quick, I wanted to address some of the questions that came up in a previous session. I know we had our guests and weren't able to necessarily take the FCPS specific questions. Just real quick, there was a question about whether how messages are being sent out to the community by people that are trusted. So of course, in addition to the regular updates coming from our superintendent, we do have parent liaisons who continue to facilitate avenues of communication with our families, particularly those who are most vulnerable, which I believe the question was addressed for. No doubt though, this is an unprecedented time and there are gaps. And this is part of why I'm trying to do this, and others are trying to do all sorts of different things communication wise. And we're open to certainly trying to continue to push for that. I know we've been trying to push the superintendent to think of ways to reach those who otherwise are not tuned in and following these things, who may have the most need. So that point was well taken. There was a question on going back to school in the fall, potentially 6 feet apart, or how that's going to work. So as of right now, the superintendent will be presenting potential paths towards phasing back in our next school board meeting. So next week, actually. So we'll be taking a look and making decisions based on that. And finally, before we transition here, someone asked about mental health resources. I wanted to make sure I reiterated what's available. And again, Sunday, we'll be going over all of these in more depth. But for right now, there is a form on the FCPS website under FAQ, subheading mental health, for those who want to seek a 30-minute consultation session with our school psychologists and social workers. So be sure to fill that out. Crisis link is always available to everyone. That is 703-527-4077. In addition to the Mental Health Service Administration Disaster Distress Hotline, which is particularly addressing transition, socio-emotional needs with the transition during COVID, 1-800-985-5990, that's available to anyone. And then there is a domestic violence hotline as well, which, as we know, we've seen a spike in as a result of everyone being home. All of the, several of these are available anonymously and are multilingual. And that line is 1-800-799-7233. All right, so with that, we are going to transition into the next segment of our conversation here with Leslie Sale. So I'll have her take it, and you guys can send the questions in, and we'll address them as soon as she's finished with her overview. So go ahead, Leslie. Thanks again for joining.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you, Abrar and Kimberly, for inviting me. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't start the conversation just generally thanking all of our teachers, as it's Educator Appreciation Week. And then, of course, just amazed at your resilience and Fairfax, and all of the amazing things that you have going on there. And it was wonderful to hear the updates that you guys have going on, and the progress and all the good work that you're doing under unprecedented circumstances. So as a community, you guys should feel very proud of yourselves. So at Abrar's suggestion, I wanted to start a little bit. So I'll start with a kind of overview of my role and my position with the Department of Education. And then, of course, a little bit how my role and position fits into the larger piece of the puzzle, which is education policy. Talk a little bit about how that might impact your day-to-day experience as a Fairfax student or teacher, or whomever might be, community member, whomever might be participating. And then, of course, talk a little bit about how things are evolving with the COVID-19 and the pandemic, and of course, the extended school closures. So as I introduce myself, I'm Leslie Sale. I'm the Director of Policy at the Virginia Department of Education. A little bit about our organizational structure. So the Office of Policy is a subset of what's called the Department of Policy, Equity, and Communications. And in that way, so part of our larger department role is thinking about how we interface with everyone outside of our department, right? So that's our public constituents, our media, folks and personnel who are doing the hard-hitting journalism and really researching. It's our school divisions and leadership who are trying to make sure they're plugged in with state work, students, teachers, all of that. And then of course our legislators, so everyone who's responsible for developing, creating, refining, looking at education policy. So under that heading, my particular office, the Office of Policy, our emphasis is really on that legislator component. So we really are a touch point at the department for education policy from conception to implementation. And that means we take on and wear a number of hats and take on a number of different roles over the course of the year. I think maybe the kind of easiest way to explain it. So there's a lot of moving parts with education policy, but obviously, we are there when legislation is passed, which we recently had the 2020 General Assembly session. So right now, something that we're working on is making sure all of the new bills and legislation and mandates that have come from the General Assembly are being executed and implemented in a way that's being translated to our school divisions in a way that's effective. And then, of course, providing information and continuing resources and technical support. But then on an ongoing basis, of course, as people are thinking about education policy, providing resources in our content experience and our technical experience, and thinking about what meaningful policy might look like, where needs exist, and then of course, how execution and processes actually work. And so how we can think about policy and kind of a well-oiled machine that's already in place there. So I guess, and from there, and maybe I should have started with this, but so a lot of the work that we do, and I is part of a larger machine, like I said, that deals with education policy. So it's kind of important to understand where the Department of Education and then of course our office fits in to the larger conversation around policy and the K-12 experience. So of course, as I mentioned, we have our General Assembly members, which are our elected officials and our legislators who, go to General Assembly every January and February and sometimes into March to make some decisions based on what in our statutory language, so that's our legal language, needs to be changed and revisited or added or deleted or whatever may be the case. From there, we kind of pick up that next piece of the puzzle and make sure things are being implemented and executed as they should. Of course, providing technical assistance to our legislators along the way. But something maybe less well known is that there's other kind of moving parts to the education policy piece. So while this may all sound very familiar to our students of government who know the three branches of government well, we have our legislative, our executive, and judicial branches. There's also a regulatory component of this, and that's our Board of Education. And so for policy geeks like me, this is all born from the Constitution of Virginia. So the Constitution has put a lot of pieces in place, one of them being our Board of Education, which has general supervision over our schools in Virginia. So they're responsible and tasked with kind of thinking about our broad goals and what we want to see statewide in terms of instruction, and making sure all of Virginia's learners have access to that instruction and have parity in that instruction. And then, of course, part of the Constitution too is that our local school boards and local school divisions have a lot of discretion over what's happening on that day-to-day basis. So while the Board of Education sets those big, lofty goals for us to keep in mind and aspire to and achieve, and of course a minimum baseline to make sure we're all getting across the same threshold, our local school divisions have a lot of choice in what that looks like, and making sure that we are crossing that threshold, and then they can put on kind of the creative element to think about how it's executed on that day-to-day basis. So with that being said, we work with all of these individual actors, to make sure that the state level education policy is well understood, well implemented, that school divisions have the resources and guidance that they need to do what they need to do, and then of course whatever we can do to support the K-12 education system along the way. One of the questions that I love that Abrar asked was, how that affects folks on a day-to-day basis. So it, being at the state level and, being removed even geographically, so us being based in Richmond, it can feel a little distant and not always clear how we have an impact on the education system. And I guess I'd just like to draw from kind of an example from this last General Assembly session. We had a number of bills come out around adding a diversity and an equity lens to how we approach education, both in an academic and a non-academic way. So two of the bills that came out were to implement it's a long name, so I want to make sure I get it right. The Culturally Relevant and Inclusive Education Practices Advisory Committee is one of the items that came out of this year's legislation session or General Assembly session, as well as rethinking dress codes with that equity and diversity lens, to make sure that that's reflected in our local school divisions, school board policies as well. And so with that being said, I mean, we're right now we are actively thinking of ways to engage stakeholders and engage people who are thinking about the tough issues. So that translates to your classroom, not just in how you think about history and social science and adding that diversity and equity lens, but also, how you dress and the student code of conduct and all of that. And so while it can seem far removed what happens at the state level in the General Assembly, and then of course our role as the executive agency, it really does have an impact on the day-to-day basis. But with that being said, our role has certainly evolved, as everyone's during the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, one of our initial responses when the extended school closures happened was more or less the reactive response. So thinking about all of those things that are no longer on the table. So one of the big issues being, SOL testing and assessments and all of those things and mechanisms we use as a checkpoint to make sure our students are getting the instruction that they need and are doing well at it. And then, of course, with that information, we can help provide remediation services, intervention services, things like that. So it is such an important part of our educational system to know how our students are doing and have that checkpoint with them. That has changed. So not being in the classroom, a lot of the assessment protocols have evolved and changed. And so making sure schools can remain compliant and not, not, I guess, shirk any of their responsibilities to the student, but making sure that because of that change, no student is falling through the cracks, and we're still addressing all of the instructional and academic and well-being needs of our students. So that was, for example, one of the big ones that come to mind. But we are thinking about this on an ongoing basis. So assessment being a big one. One of the things that our team has recently talked about and addressed and actually got approval for today is for our graduating seniors who have been working towards getting those additional diploma seals, and had just needed one last assessment or one last item that the closures made it an inaccessible criteria or an eligibility element, how we can rethink about those seals so folks who have worked hard and done well and deserve the recognition can still get that. And we've thought across the board on a number of different items. So diploma seals being one of them that comes to mind because it's recent. Assessment elements, thinking about how to support home instruction students. It runs the whole gamut. There's a lot of different components to making sure, again, schools are remaining compliant, but of course we're supporting students and making sure that no one feels like they're penalized for this school closure. Something that is pretty interesting in a way that our role has evolved through the COVID-19. So as part of the executive agency, we're led by the superintendent of public instruction. And when the declared state of emergency initially happened, Executive Order 51, which was issued by the governor, had given the superintendent of public instruction a lot of discretion to respond to regulatory elements. So those are the items that are coming out of our Board of Education, and providing flexibility and waivers where appropriate. Recently, during reconvene session at the end of April, the General Assembly voted to add some language to our budget bill that allows the superintendent of public instruction to address other compliant issues that are in the Code of Virginia. So if you kind of think about statutory and regulatory or legal language in a hierarchy, we have our budget language, our code language, and then our regulatory language. So whereas at the beginning of the declared state of emergency, we were able to respond to a lot of stuff that's in regulation, now we're able to think even bigger in terms of what our students need, what our teachers need, what our schools need to feel supported, to not feel impeded, and to think creatively about how we use what we could almost consider an opportunity in thinking about how the classrooms can evolve and change and how instruction can evolve and change. And so that's a lot of our reactive work. So, making sure schools are, again, supported, have what they need to continue providing instruction and supporting their students. And now we're kind of shifting to a place of recovery. So thinking about what next school year is going to look like, knowing that gaps in instruction, changes in how instruction is being delivered, will inevitably affect our student populations. And so, moving forward, how can we create a system of education that really responds to all learners here? So folks that have been getting information via packets and physical, paper and all of that versus virtual settings, and what that means for us going forward to make sure that every student that graduates, from Virginia public school is just as well equipped to move on to their next step as any other students. So I know that was a mouthful and a lot of information, and I touched on some pretty technical elements, and some broader elements as well, but I'm happy to hand it back over to Abrar and Kimberly to ask any questions, and then of course any questions from the audience as well.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. I really appreciate that overview. For our audience, I was emphasizing too, of course, sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around all these different pieces, and you did a nice job of breaking down, what the policies are, how to think about them. And as always, folks, we think of the easiest way I can kind of convey it is if we think of our state in the same way as the country a little bit, with the branches, as Leslie pointed out, right? And you have the president, who's the governor, and he has various departments like his cabinet, right? So, and that's where Leslie fits within the education part of all of that, right? So setting the policy for the state. And I'll say, adding to one of the points you mentioned, about how your decisions end up ultimately impacting the whole state. And during COVID in particular, I'd say as a local school board member, realizing more and more how much the governor and his team and the Department of Education specifically, their guidance influences what we're doing, in particular in crisis situations, you know, because a lot of these school divisions, I mean, in Fairfax included, are trying to figure things out. Some of these requirements that we're not able to meet as a result of, you know, distance learning. And we ultimately rely on, I mean, the guidance that comes from you all, whether it's things like SOL waivers or, you know, special ed accommodation and with the temporary learning plans, all sorts of pieces here that the localities have really been looking to the state for leadership on. So appreciate that. We do have a question from Angela here, particularly about a topic I am passionate about, so I appreciate you raising this. So who is representing the underrepresented students and teachers at the state level? How does the state verify that their legislative efforts are being met? So maybe if we talk a little bit about that equity piece in more depth, you touched on that's a consideration for you all, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so of course, everything we do, we try to bring an equity lens to. So, and a little bit about the Department of Education. I mean, we have a lot of different departments. So I am just one small cog. So our Office of Instruction, or Department of Instruction and Learning and Innovation, our Office of Technology, our Office of Special Education and Student Support Services, we all try to remain very cognizant and bring that equity lens to the table. But something that we also have at the department, which is a resource for us and the state as a whole, is our, and it's part of our umbrella, the Department of Policy, Equity, and Communications, is our Office of Equity. So with that, you know, their job is to kind of to make sure that that lens remains in place, that it remains kind of true to the focus of serving all learners. And it's something that, you know, we've been thinking about much more actively with this particular board and our superintendent. And I guess just a little bit of political context. So the Board of Education, which is our regulatory board and our policymaking board, has to present a comprehensive plan every 5 years. And part of this our current comprehensive plan is making sure that equities and achievement gaps are addressed. So they're kind of setting the tone for all of the work that we do in the office and keeping those items in mind. And then of course, the superintendent of public instruction kind of heralded this concept of Virginia is for learners, and not just that, Virginia is for all learners. So even in our kind of branding and the way that we're interfacing and making sure that we're communicating with our constituents and audiences has a much more explicit equity lens to really reflect that as a priority and a value for us. So from the department side, we always try to bring that equity lens, and then we leverage our kind of specialty teams like the Office of Equity to make sure that anything that comes out of our department has that extra pair of eyes. And then of course that, it's one of the things that when we are providing technical support to our legislators when they're thinking about policy creation and implementation. So whereas we execute, they're the ones that actually put the letter of the law in place, making sure that we provide them with all of the information that we can. So bringing to the table that information that comes from our content experts, bringing information around data, which I think can be very telling in a lot of these situations where we're talking about equity. When you get down to the numbers, you can really see some discrepancies in terms of how different student populations are being served, who's doing well, who's struggling, who do we need to support more. And making sure that they have that information, so anything that they put into code, it has that tone and is observant and conscious of those demographics and pieces of data.
Yeah, no, and rightfully so. I mean, even, I know a lot of localities look to Fairfax County because it's one of the wealthier counties and is doing different things. But even, on a local level, certainly having incredible disparities and folks who live, you can imagine the entire class spectrum from folks who are homeless and live in poverty to folks who are, millionaires living in this county, probably billionaires. I mean, I haven't met them, but yeah, no. So I'm curious to delve even deeper into this equity piece and how you begin to think of it when implementing, whether it's, theoretical or I'll give an example. I mean, on a local level, I know Fairfax County, we've moved towards, and I pushed this largely as I was actually running, but the concept of targeted universalism, right? That's one of the frameworks, that's a tool. So for the average person, that's a lot of jargon. It's definitely coming out of the academia world, sphere, academic sphere. But it's this idea that as policies are made, we not only want to think of its implications on, the people in the room or the people who we can imagine to be in the room, but on every profile of individual that could exist in our locality, right? So if we focus on the most vulnerable person on all levels, so what people with disability, who may also be minority, who may also live in poverty, who may have all these challenges, and we cater a system that works for that person, then we're actually able to, by default, naturally, set up a system that works for everyone, right? Because it accounts for all those vulnerabilities and gaps. That's an example, of a framework that I know on the county level. It started to be adopted here in Fairfax County. Sorry, my fasting brain is a little bit, it's playing a role here. But yeah, so I'm curious on your end, what frameworks or ways of really bringing the big picture equity lens, which is often talked about, and a lot of people kind of throw that around, but how does that come into reality in this work, and in particular with the COVID response and your thinking around that?
Sure. Well, so, I don't want to, overstep and speak for kind of our Office of Equity, who does this work much more intimately. But I guess I can provide a little bit of context from the policy perspective, and I think maybe something that might be meaningful in thinking about how, I don't know if it's necessarily thinking about a framework, but how the conversation has informed our recent kind of regulatory, I guess, creating a framework. So that might be the better way to do it. That I don't know if there's any one academic or theoretical or approach has really informed, and I again, the Office of Equity may be able to put a name on it, but I do know how it's informed our framework. And one of the big items I might just kind of call to attention, and 2018, 2019, it was last year, it feels like lifetimes ago, but we had just implemented, or the Board of Education had just implemented the new standards of accreditation. And a big part of that, and a big part of the information that informed this, was this idea of a profile of a Virginia graduate. So it was starting to move away from thinking about a student as only their test scores, which only captures one piece of it's only one segment of a whole, and starting to think about what other ways can we evaluate student health and school health, because while assessments are important as a checkpoint in making sure that, again, instruction's being delivered and in a fair and equal way, we needed to paint a fuller picture. And so the profile of the Virginia graduate really started to thinking about, so it's not just necessarily test scores, but it's whether students can communicate, can collaborate, can create, are creative thinkers, are good constituents, good citizens. And when you have this fuller picture of what we want students to walk away from with the education, we can really think about how our system is capturing data and understanding what students are getting from the system. And then what we're doing now is actually kind of moving into a phase where we can provide more targeted support in that regard. So I think we're kind of in the middle of that. So we've thought about what we really want every student to get out of the public education system. Our standards of accreditation, which are pretty pivotal for our local school divisions. Those are things that they strive for their accreditation status. Is not just about assessment, but things like chronic absenteeism, which is an element of engagement. Are students coming to school? Are they participating? Are they getting the opportunity to be in the classroom? Are we closing achievement gaps? So a student who may not have gotten the pass score on the SOL, but has come leaps and bounds from where they were last year, that is worthwhile, and that is worth acknowledging and giving schools credit for, that they're really getting students caught up. And so again, piecing the career and civic engagement index, which will be forthcoming, is an item to make sure students are just getting more than just a classroom experience, but a life experience. And so all of these pieces are what we're looking to see from our school divisions now. And then I think the next piece of that or the next part of that timeline is, now that we really see what we want from our school divisions, thinking about how we support our school divisions and getting students there. So I think that's kind of how equity is really playing into that policy side and that regulatory side. Again, I don't know if I have a name for the framework that's informing it, but it's certainly part of a conversation from conception to implementation here.
No, 100%. That was incredibly helpful because, yeah, one of the things I did want to ask actually was about test scores. It's something, even on the local level now, we're realizing, I mean, some of us have always known that it's not a perfect indicator, right, of student performance or excellence. But even more so now with COVID, the fact that we can't hold kids to certain standards because they're not being instructed in that way. So I know I definitely appreciate your points on that and look forward to seeing what comes out of the state. I think that's definitely one of, the new Secretary of Education's great initiatives, and I hope will be carried forward, and we look forward to receiving it. I know as a board, we always talk about, test scores not being a good predictor. So particularly from an equity lens. There is another
I think, I was just going to mention from
go ahead.
It just being because we certainly still value test scores and we are our assessment team, which is incredible as well, always thinking about what testing can mean for students, but just understanding as part of a broader picture.
Right. Yeah. Thinking more holistically. Yeah. The test score is what it is. It might give a very narrow picture. But yeah, no doubt. And particularly, I mean, with students with special needs, for example, who may exhibit, differently, right? The skill sets that they're developing and how you want to track them. So yeah, no, I appreciate that caveat there. So how will equity of programs offered in different pyramids be addressed? So yeah, this is a local question. This is something certainly we're looking at. I know right now in our current budget, which we're obviously debating and discussing on Monday, but there is a placeholder for Region 2 and 3 executive principal in addition to the existing ones, because all the regions right now have 2, but those are significantly higher need, have way more schools with free and reduced meal rates. So that's one of the initiatives that's being put forth, but certainly a worthwhile conversation to be had and a good point that you're raising. So thank you, Kathy. Another question, expected this at some point. I know it's not specifically policy related, but you can comment on it and I'll try to fill in from my perspective. So what will the next academic year look like? Will we start on time in the fall? Will first quarter be solely online? When we eventually come back to school, what will that look like? So maybe give us a sense of the policy conversations surrounding this, if you've had any, particularly thinking, long-term, I imagine, for your office. And then I can comment on the implementation piece.
Sure. Well, so it's going to look different for every school division. So as you guys know, when the school closed on March 13th, we have 132 different school divisions across the state. So individual school divisions' capacity to maintain instruction and continuity of instruction look differently for everyone. And so what next school year will look like will really be a kind of a local element. It will really matter how much instruction was lost, how much needs to be caught up, of course. And then there are the other non-academic parts of it too. How we're thinking about well-being moving into the new school year, knowing that so much has changed and there's been a lot of tumult and evolution and not having that sense of routine. That school divisions as not just an academic resource for students, but a wraparound service for students will need to address, and obviously thinking about that in recovery. In terms of when and what it will look like, the Department of Education is thinking through a lot of different scenarios, but I think the central and key value for us is the health and safety of our students. So until we get kind of a clear public health directive on what congregation looks like, what social distancing looks like, what healthy sizes of groups look like, we really won't know what school will look like either. But knowing that, that being our priority, that we're evaluating what it could look like on a number of different fronts.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. And certainly on the local level, taking whatever guidance comes from the state and trying to think of the ways to phase out. As I mentioned in the beginning of this, the governor has kind of put forward some tentative plan here as we're moving out of this. And the school systems I'll speak for Fairfax, are certainly moving in that direction. The superintendent will be presenting possible paths to the school board next week. And we're going to obviously discuss and figure out which of them is the best. But to Leslie's point, and the secretary mentioned in a previous call as well, the economy will bounce back. We can figure out these challenges that we're facing, but you can't bring back lives. And there is a real risk of just kind of opening back up and thinking that everything's going to be normal. The CDC has been projecting, potential death rates and all of it. So there's a lot of data out there, and localities are certainly working with their health departments, as I'm sure on the state level, everyone is working with their counterpart in making sure that we make the right decisions that are safe and smart for everyone. So thank you for that question, Kelly. Another question, let's see. Angela, yes, I think, we can definitely have an equity person in the future. I'll be happy to talk to you more about who that might be. Question, so how will the Department of Education go about designing the policy mandated? So non-conforming, gender non-conforming students, trans students. I don't know on your level what the policy situation looks like. I can certainly speak to it locally, but if you would comment a little bit, maybe broadly too, on accommodating minorities, what policy exists, and then in particular to address Robert's question, thanks for asking, trans students.
Sure. Well, there was actually new legislation that passed out of the 2020 General Assembly that tasked the Department of Education with thinking about model school policies around the treatment of transgender students. With that regard to that, that specific question, it's something that we're thinking about. So it was just kind of a mandate but a mandate from the General Assembly for us to start thinking about. And I don't want to misspeak, but with the expectation that we could provide our local school divisions with some model policies that they could then implement at the local level. I don't believe next year, but I will, and I don't want to misspeak, but there is a certain timeline in which we can expect to see some more kind of concrete information coming from the department around transgender policies. From a more minority perspective, so there's kind of a number of different avenues. Obviously, like I said, we try to keep an equity lens and a diversity lens on everything that we do. We're thinking about it from an instructional standpoint. So standards of learning, which I think is a term that we often in a school level think about in terms of just assessment. But standards of learning are actually the things that we intend to guide instruction in our schools. And they go through a review period every 7 years. And so every time we do this, we're making sure that, kind of contemporary standards and equity standards and are all being reflected and appropriately reflected and what's being taught in the classroom. And then from a kind of non-academic perspective, of course, we have things like the Model Code of Conduct, which, we provide to our local school divisions to help guide them in thinking through how to address things like dress codes, disciplinary action, items like that, of course, all with an equity lens. And I know there's plenty more. I'm just kind of blanking on some of them at the moment. But it's a lot of different kind of components that we provide, school division supports on. So I don't know if I could say I could point to one like umbrella item that's addressing all of these things all at the same time, but all of those contexts about thinking about all of our students are informing each of these individual kind of guidance documents coming from the department. And I guess I should mention too, just to clarify kind of the department's role. So, the General Assembly ultimately decides like code and statute language and our role to implement it. So we do, work to make it as functional on a statewide level, and then of course provide support to our local school divisions. In terms of policy development, while we provide technical assistance, we're not responsible for necessarily creating the policy itself, but just making sure the way that it's implemented has all of those dimensions in mind.
Yeah, no, thank you for mentioning that. And I'll say on the local level, as we gain guidance from the state, actually before that, so a lot of, as you pointed out, comes from the General Assembly, right? Which, if you really want to break it down, it's like Congress for our state. But basically, they decide, they make some of these laws on the state level, and those policies end up coming to certainly the Department of Education, and then on the local level, us to have to figure out how to implement. So if you're interested in what came out of this cycle or this session that just ended not too long ago, there is an attachment on board docs, which is where all the school board materials are housed. If you're looking at Fairfax County specifically, and the legislative updates that come out of that. So in basic English, the decisions they made and that are impacting education specifically, and in our locality is Fairfax County, there's a long presentation on what those specifically are. And one of those being, of course, accommodations for students, as you pointed out. I'll also add, I know that we have looked at in closed session some of this material. Obviously, I can't comment too much further on what was discussed there. But since that meeting, believe it or not, it's actually right next to me. I have a copy of the discrimination policy, the anti-discrimination policy for our school system, and have been kind of thinking about how we can perfect it. So Robert, I know you will continue to be in touch, and you've been a great advocate for the community anyway, and I look forward to talking offline about how we can facilitate that further on the local level. So great. Another question. So hey, Rin, hi, it's good to see you. She's one of our active students and very passionate about education policy. I've come to get to know her recently. So Leslie, I'm sure she'll be very happy to hear from you. Is there any ongoing policy work that will require us to wear face masks or coverings upon return to school? Interesting. Maybe comment even on how you guys interface with the health department or the health side of things. More broadly, and then if you want to address the specific question.
Sure. Well, we are obviously in very close contact with the Virginia Department of Health, which is more or less our health equivalent at the state level, who is providing us with the public health guidance and up-to-date information. And then, of course, making sure that anything that comes from our department about how schools can continue with continuity of learning, what meal pickups look like, all of that stuff is very cognizant of what's in the best interest of the health and safety of our communities and our students. Without knowing when things are going to reopen, the Department of Health hasn't provided any specific guidance about what sort of health precautions that students will need to take if they're back in a classroom in a normal setting. So I wish I had more specifics for you on that one, but it is something that I think our at a state level that we do very well is that collaborative effort to make sure that anything that's coming from our department is reflective of the latest guidance and information from the Department of Health. So as that available, or that information around school openings becomes available to us, it will certainly take into account what health precautions will look like as well.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. And how regularly are you all in conversation? I can say, on a local level, the health department and our education staff and FCPS are in touch on a daily basis. Especially in the beginning of COVID, on multiple times a day. But I don't know how often are you guys checking in about how that and implications on policy?
Sure. Well, the touch points are happening in a few different places, because obviously, the health component of all of this informs so many different how so many different things operate. And so, I feel quite confident that and I don't want to say with any specificity and misspeak, but certainly routinely that we're working with the Department of Health on all of their new guidance to come out, and being cognizant of course, what that means at an aggregate, the state level, and then of course, what those individual localities and the locality or the local departments of health can inform. So I guess unfortunately, all the specificity I can provide is routinely, because I know, whenever there's new information to come from the Department of Health, we're made aware and made sure that's reflected in our guidance and information. But, that it evolves on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can only imagine, in particular with making decisions for the future and shaping policy. The evolving situation means that we need to take it as it comes, right? So, 100%. So we have anyone else here who has a question, shoot it now, because we are almost at our time. But we have a question here. So from Cher, if we have to continue distance learning into the new school year, will items start to be graded? Right now, everything with distance learning is optional in FCPS. Is that correct? So clarifying locally, and then I would love to hear from you guys as to the state policy side of things with grading. As of right now, fourth quarter is pass fail. A lot of this is guidance from the state. The overall grade, which is normally an average of the grade from first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, will still be an average grade of the first 3 quarters. Students had an opportunity to make up work that they had missed perhaps because of the closure. There was an extensive period of time that ended recently, but for them to make up that work for third quarter. So again, as of now, fourth quarter is pass fail, and the overall grade is still an average as usual. And all students who are expected to be promoted and expected to graduate should be doing so. Anyone who kind of falls behind as a result of access issues or any of the things we're facing will be contacted, and hopefully the gap will be made up for over the summer. So yeah, Leslie, go ahead from a state level.
Well, yeah, so I think you kind of touched on one of our primary considerations around grading. Obviously, grading is a local decision. So as I mentioned, the kind of routine day-to-day operations of every school division, we leave to the local school board, recognizing that every local school division will look a little bit different. But with that being said, as we think about what sort of guidance and information we can provide to our local school divisions throughout grading if distance learning continues, the biggest consideration is that equity element, that it would be unfair to hold students accountable in the same way if we're not able to provide the same type of instruction and supports to all of our students. So as school divisions are becoming more acclimated to distance learning, have incorporated the accommodations that students might need to make sure that they're doing as well in the classroom as they should be and can be, that will be an evolving conversation, but certainly we wouldn't want to advise anyone to action that too quickly, knowing that if you do grade, it's a measure of accountability for students. So you want to make sure that every student had a chance to do as well as they could on every assignment that you grade.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for pointing that out. And I will say colleges are also understanding of that. There's a lot, there's collaboration always with offices, and we're receiving information that most of them are aware that this is a highly unusual quarter and things are not really normal. So accountability is going to look different. Similar to, I'm sure those of you who wanted to take the SAT know that not all colleges are requiring that for admission this coming cycle, right? Yeah, Kimberly's nodding her head. I know she's looking at admissions and applications for the coming year. So just keeping that in mind.
And
go ahead.
Abrar, we are actively working with the Student Council of Higher Education in Virginia, and then of course the Secretary of Education's office has a Deputy Secretary of Higher Education, because we understand that what we're doing right now is not in a silo. So what we're preparing you to go into the world and do very much depends on what other folks are actively doing, whether businesses are hiring, whether schools have what they need to make admission decision. So we're certainly very aware of the fact that every decision we make ultimately will impact an ability to take a next step. And so we're keeping those lines of communication open so everyone's on the same page.
Thank you for that. Great. So with that, as we close out here, maybe from all, Kimberly, you can chime in here too, but maybe a final message of hope. What would be your kind of closing send off to the community from where you are in Richmond, I'm assuming? So.
Sure. Well, just from to keep it in the kind of lens of the Department of Education and the work that's being done there. And again, kind of to mirror the all that I have for Fairfax at the moment, and all the work that you guys are doing to make sure that, students are learning and well fed and happy and have are in a good mind state. The amount of time and energy that the team at the Department of Education has put into making sure we can be as responsive and thoughtful and considerate as we can be moving forward is amazing. And I think it's really indicative of just kind of a larger culture that everyone is working to to the benefit of everyone else. And it feels like a very selfless community at the moment, which is wonderful to see. Not that that group doesn't do amazing work on a normal day, but just the energy and motivation around it is, I think, should give people some comfort and relief that if these are topics on your mind, they're on ours as well. So just knowing that you're kind of, and also to that end, that you're not alone in it, that we're all thinking about the same things and all troubleshooting the same things, and confident there are solutions to all of them.
Kimberly, you want to step in?
Yeah. I mean, I said most of what I said before. Like, I always say to, like, make sure we're staying safe so that we can all come out of this together. I think to also add something in, I think what I've found to stay like grounded, find like something that makes you look forward to keep like just continue. For me, like, to make sure I don't go crazy, I write, and I paint some random like paint by numbers kits. And there's just small like menial things that kind of like make sure that we stay sane and that we have something to look forward to. I find that having something to look forward to every day really helps to make sure that the days don't just drag on, because it's easy to let that happen. So making sure there's something that you can really like think about and just take care of yourself. That's really all I can really ask everyone to do, is to take care of themselves.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kimberly. You know, whether it's our student rep juggling school board meetings in between classes, or obviously our, one of our directors of policy on the state level, and all the great work, I've been inspired and pleasantly surprised that the efforts folks have put forth, and the great thinking that's come out of the state in how it's guided us in our localities. So thank you so much, Leslie. It's been a pleasure having you on today. I look forward to continuing to collaborate through our work and what we're doing here for the community. And reminder to everyone who's watching, next session on Sunday at 7 p.m. we have a mental health session. So we're going to bring experts, including representatives from Our Minds Matter and others, who are going to cover extensively resources that are available for you, your children, your neighbors, yourself. And we look forward to the conversation there. As always, Thursdays and Sundays at 7 p.m. on Facebook Live. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you at the next QuaranSTREAM.